Joe Biden has delivered his first address to Congress since winning the White House, promising to muscle up to China in the Indo-Pacific and unveiling a $1.8 trillion spending bill on education and childcare. Joe also wants us not to build back better, but to build back better. What?
We have to do more than just build back better. We have to build back better.
I'm thoroughly confused. So to discuss this and more, I'm joined from Sydney by the co-host of Outsiders, James Morrow, and from Adelaide by host of Bernardi, Cory Bernardi. Gentlemen, let's start with you, Cory. $6.4 trillion worth of spending, a bit more than I mentioned in my intro. This is going to be the biggest spending increase in American history. What's your reaction to it, Cory? Is it onwards and upwards from America?
Oh, no, I think it's a disaster. But the only way they can get themselves out of this debt trap, Rita, is to actually borrow more money and throw it into the system in the hope of fueling inflation. And of course, Joe Biden is looking at legacy. He just wants to be known, because he's not going to be there for very long. I think we can all presume that. But he just wants to be known as the bloke who created a legacy. And so there'll be Biden dams and Biden roads and Biden Dementia Centres. There'll be all sorts of stuff happening, and a whole bunch of little Biden apparatchiks who get into the preschools 3 years earlier to get indoctrinated earlier into the leftist claptrap that he's enjoying.
James, he seemed to be quite fixated on the January 6th riot, or as the Democrats and the media call it, the insurrection. Let's have a look at what he had to say there.
The insurrection was an existential crisis, a test of whether our democracy could survive, and it did. But the struggle is far from over. The question of whether our democracy will long endure is both ancient and urgent. As old as our republic, still vital today.
He said a lot worse than that, James. Tell us about his focus on the insurrection, which I think he called it the greatest threat to democracy since the Civil War.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of hyperbole, or as we say on Outsiders, hyperbole, Rita. But, you know, the interesting thing about this is how that event, which was a terrible event, no one's condoning what happened there, has now become... Rita, it has become the creation myth for the entire legitimacy, I guess you would say, of the Biden progressive project which they're working on. And that's the fascinating thing to me about this. You know, Joe Biden, he's been in politics for decades. He was always an idiot, but he was always a centrist idiot. And the question I have now is, who is in his ear? Who is actually pulling the strings now? Because the agenda that he is taking America down is a very, very radical one, really much more towards the direction of the most left-wing European social democracies. I mean, not just the free preschool indoctrination camps that Cory was talking about a moment ago, but, you know, more about free college, free this, free that. Well, you know, someone's going to have to pay for it. They're kicking the can down the road. I'm terrified of what that means for the world economy if hyperinflation kicks in the United States. And, you know, the other thing is he talked about unity throughout his speech, and yet all of that talk about the so-called insurrection was the most divisive stuff you'll ever hear, because he's telling half of Americans that they're criminals.
Absolutely. And the nonsense about the insurrection, the riot, of course, we all criticise the riot. A riot is what it was. But to call it an insurrection and say it was the biggest threat to democracy when we've had bombs go off, we've had presidents assassinated, we've had multiple presidents almost assassinated, not to mention the ones where it was successful. I mean, the threats against democracy in America's history are numerous and serious. And to elevate this riot on top of all that is utterly insane, and it is all about demonising Trump voters. So essentially half the country is cast as deplorables, which isn't very unifying. Now, let's go to South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who gave the Republicans' response to Joe Biden. He's a black senator, and he was pretty widely praised for his address. But have a look at this racist slur that was promoted and pushed on Twitter by the left. It is absolutely disgusting. Uncle Tim was trending. That's just despicable, isn't it, Cory?
Yeah, it is terrible, but what do you expect from the lefties? They play by their own rules, they accuse everyone else of what they're guilty of themselves, and they basically hate anyone that doesn't support their Marxist agenda. Now, Tim Scott has been talked about by some of the Never-Trumpers today as a future presidential candidate, but basically his message was one of inspiration. The first black man elected to both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And he said America is not a racist country, it's a country of opportunity. And I think that's a very good message to have. It's much better than Joe Biden's socialist dogma that I'll give him credit, he got through it, but it was just a plethora of socialist platitudes and agendas that I think will damage the very fabric of America in the long term.
Now, let's go across to the UK quickly. The UK has almost got herd immunity, we're hearing, from COVID-19, with 7 in 10 British adults now having antibodies against the virus. According to the Office of National Statistics, some 68% of adults now have some protection from the virus, either from a prior infection or after receiving a vaccine. James, Boris Johnson's got a few issues at the moment, but the one thing he's got right has been the vaccine rollout. He's shut down the country, he's devastated businesses, he's got an enormous death rate. He's done plenty wrong, but you can't really fault him on the vaccine rollout.
No, you can't at all. And you have to say that the vaccine rollout is one of the great triumphs of Brexit. You know, it never would have been possible had the UK been stuck in the EU, which is having huge difficulties getting jabs into arms over there. But it's also worth noting, you know, they put themselves on a war footing. They got the AstraZeneca into everybody they could. They've now got virtual herd immunity approaching. They're going to get back to normal. There's a lesson for all of this in Australia. You know, every time we make a huge deal about one small thing going wrong with the program, or, you know, take one case that's gone wrong out of millions of jabs, we put the can of normality down the road so much further. And I think we need to look at Britain and say, you know what, there is a better way. We can come through this quicker and together and get back to normal sooner.
Well, yeah, let's hope so. But our vaccine rollout, Cory, isn't proceeding at a similar pace. But let's stay with the international news with you two gentlemen. Let's go back to New York, where the governor there, Andrew Cuomo, is being accused of being engaged in a sustained effort to obscure the COVID-19 death toll in the state's nursing homes, according to another bombshell report, this time in, I think, the New York Times. They're saying that Cuomo's aides repeatedly stymied efforts from officials to reveal the true extent of the crisis. All the while, the governor was writing a book on his handling of the pandemic and, Cory, getting all sorts of plaudits from the media, from Hollywood celebrities. He won an Emmy. He was held up as the gold standard, despite the fact that even with the deaths they were actually declaring, New York had the highest death rate in America, bar one state, New Jersey. And yet he was lauded as a saviour.
It's just incredible, Rita. I remember Ellen DeGeneres declared herself, she was so in love with Cuomo that she said she was a Cuomosexual. It was just a disgrace. And this bloke represents everything that is bad about politics and the disingenuousness of the left. You've got, first of all, he's covered up the death toll. They've tried to hide the facts coming out. He's an accused sexual harasser. All the things that he levelled at everyone else. His track record is absolutely appalling, and yet somehow he got away with it. There was no real critical media examination of him. Politics, media in America is absolutely broken and busted.
Oh, absolutely. And James, these stories only got coverage in the mainstream media once Trump was out of the way, because Cuomo was their saviour. Right. He was the example to say, imagine if he was president and not Trump, we'd be so much better off. Never mind, New York's death rate was 5 times the national average at some point. So you're a New Yorker. Tell us how you see it.
Well, you know, I got to say also, Rita, we were talking about this and the Cuomo death rate long before the New York Times picked up on it. You know, you and I have spoken about this on Outsiders. I've written about this in the Daily Telegraph last year, many months ago. And now that Trump is out of office, you know, finally they can go after Cuomo. They all knew They all knew exactly what he was doing, but they
knew.
just chose not to cover it.
Absolutely. The death rate itself, the fact that New York's death rate was so much higher than the national average should have given them a clue. But no. And of course, he ordered nursing homes to take back infected patients. So he released the virus into the most vulnerable group. And of course, there were thousands of unnecessary deaths from that alone, never mind all the other catastrophe that he brought about. What an absolute shambolic mess. Thank you so much, Cory Bernardi, James Morrow, for your time this evening.
Thanks, Rita.
Thanks, Rita.